Imagine Mesopotamia, a land shimmering beneath an endless golden sun. The year is 651 after Christ. In a quiet corner of this ancient world, a once mighty king named Yazdegerd III faces his final moments. With his last breath, he brings an era to a close. The Sassanid Empire, a realm that had shaped Persia for more than 4 centuries, now gives way to the changing winds of history. But let's rewind for a moment. The story of the Sassanids isn't just about an ending. It is a tale of bold beginnings, of a people rising from the ashes of the Parthian Empire. Picture a land where old powers had grown tired and divided, and where hope seemed as distant as the stars. Out of this chaos, a new dream took form. The Sassanids, inspired by the legendary kings of ancient Persia, imagined a world reborn with brilliance and unity. What made the Sassanids so extraordinary? For starters, they were not just warriors, though they could ride and fight with the best of them. They were also visionaries and builders. Under their rule, Persia became a crossroads of ideas, art, and faith. The empire's rulers saw themselves as guardians of an ancient flame, protectors of Zoroastrianism, the world's oldest monotheistic religion. Temples of sacred fire flickered across the empire, a symbol of hope and resilience. Yet, this was no closed society. Within the bustling cities of the Sassanid world, you could find Christians, Jews, and many other communities living side by side. Markets buzzed with merchants trading silk, spices, and stories from far-off lands. Persia's thinkers and doctors wrote books that would inspire future generations, while artists carved their victories into stone for all to see. Even Rome, the eternal empire to the west, felt the Sassanid presence. There were times when Persian kings captured Roman emperors, etching their victories into the cliffs of Nakhche-Rostam as a reminder that power can shift in surprising ways. But the Sassanids were not just rivals or conquerors, they were also inventors. Did you know that they created a system of underground canals called qanats, which turned dry deserts into thriving farmlands? Or that their system of administration, the divan, was so effective that it inspired future Islamic rulers? Of course, no empire lasts forever. After centuries of struggle, the Sassanids found themselves caught in a storm of endless wars with Byzantium to the west and a new force rising from the deserts to the south. In less than a generation, the armies of Islam swept across Persia, and the last Sassanid king became a memory. Yet the echoes of the Sassanids linger. Their influence lives on in Persian language, in art, in the way people still tell stories of ancient glory and lost empires. They were the last guardians of an old world, standing at the edge of a new era. So, as we begin our journey through the story of the Sassanid dynasty, ask yourself, what does it take for a civilization to rise, to shine, and eventually to fade? And what can we learn from their triumphs and tragedies? If you love stories like this, stories of courage, discovery, and the human spirit, please remember to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. Together, let's keep the flame of history burning bright. Picture this. It's the early 3rd century after Christ, and the once mighty Parthian Empire is slowly crumbling from within. For nearly 500 years, the Parthians had ruled over vast stretches of ancient Persia, from the Euphrates River to the mountains of Afghanistan. But now, something was terribly wrong. The royal court in Ctesiphon had become a nest of scheming nobles, each more concerned with their own wealth than the empire's survival. Local governors acted like petty kings, ignoring orders from the capital. The army, once feared across the known world, had grown soft and undisciplined. Trade routes that had brought immense riches were now plagued by bandits and rebellious vassals. The empire that had once humbled Rome itself was now a shadow of its former glory. But in a remote corner of southern Persia, in a region called Fars, the very heartland where the great Cyrus the Great had once walked, a young prince was watching all of this unfold with growing determination. His name was Ardashir, and he was about to change the course of history forever. Ardashir wasn't born into greatness. His grandfather Sassan had been a humble priest at a fire temple in Estakhr, tending to the sacred flames of Zoroaster. His father Papa had managed to rise through cunning and ambition, eventually becoming ruler of the small region of Fars. But Ardashir dreamed of something far grander than ruling a tiny province. You see, Ardashir believed, or at least claimed, that royal blood flowed through his veins. Not just any royal blood, but the blood of the legendary Achaemenid kings, who had once ruled the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Cyrus the Great, Darius I, Xerxes. These weren't just names from ancient stories to Ardashir. They were his ancestors, or so he proclaimed. Whether this was actually true remains one of history's great mysteries. Modern scholars debate whether Ardashir genuinely descended from these ancient kings, or whether this was simply brilliant propaganda designed to legitimize his revolutionary ambitions. What we do know is that Ardashir was a man of extraordinary vision and ruthless determination. While the Parthian nobles squabbled over scraps of power, he was quietly building something new: a disciplined army, a loyal administration, and most importantly, a dream of restoring Persia to its ancient glory. By the year 220, Ardashir had consolidated his power across Fars and the surrounding regions. But he wasn't content to remain a regional strongman. The Parthian king, Artabanus IV, finally recognized the growing threat from this upstart prince in the south. The two powers were on a collision course that would determine the fate of Persia for centuries to come. Artabanus was no weakling. He had fought his way to the throne and defended it against numerous challengers. But he represented everything that was wrong with the Parthian system: a king dependent on feuding nobles, leading an army more interested in personal glory than disciplined warfare, ruling an empire held together by bribes rather than genuine loyalty. Ardashir, on the other hand, represented something entirely different. He established a strong central government with cantons designed to resist the influence of hereditary interests and feudal rivalries. Where the Parthians ruled through compromise and negotiation, Ardashir would rule through strength and unwavering authority. In the spring of 224 after Christ, these two visions of Persia finally clashed on a plain called Hormozgan. The exact location has been lost to time, but the consequences of what happened there would echo through the ages. The battle was decisive and brutal. When the dust settled, Artabanus IV lay dead, and with him died the Sassanid dynasty that had ruled Persia for nearly 5 centuries. Some accounts tell us that Ardashir himself struck down the Parthian king, though we can never know if this dramatic detail is fact or legend. What followed was perhaps even more significant than the battle itself. Ardashir called himself Shahanshah, King of Kings, and began conquering the land that he called Iranshar, the realm of the Iranians. This wasn't just a change of dynasty. It was a complete transformation of how Persia saw itself. Ardashir gave rise to the use of Iran in place of Persia, and he named his dynasty after his grandfather Sassan. This might seem like a small detail, but it represented something profound. The Sassanids weren't just replacing the Parthians. They were creating a new Persian identity, one that looked back to the glorious Achaemenid past while forging boldly into the future. He established his rule in the old Parthian capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris River, but everything else was transformed. Gone were the feuding nobles and their private armies. In their place, Ardashir created a centralized bureaucracy loyal only to the crown. Gone were the casual compromises with local traditions. Instead, Zoroastrianism was elevated to become the empire's official religion, binding the realm together under one faith and one king. But perhaps most remarkably, Ardashir didn't just claim to be restoring the old Achaemenid Empire, he genuinely seemed to believe it. And somehow, through sheer force of will and brilliant leadership, he convinced an entire civilization to believe it too. This brings us back to that fascinating question raised in our story. Was Ardashir's claim to Achaemenid descent real, or was it one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns? The truth is, we may never know for certain. What we do know is that it worked magnificently. Within just a few years of that fateful battle at Hormozgan, Ardashir had transformed a crumbling collection of feuding provinces into a unified empire that would challenge Rome itself. Whether his royal bloodline was genuine or invented, his royal ambitions were absolutely real. And so began the Sassanid dynasty, 4 centuries of Persian glory that would see mighty kings humble Roman emperors, scholars preserve ancient wisdom, artists create breathtaking beauty, and warriors defend their homeland with courage that still inspires us today. All because one man looked at a dying empire and dared to dream of something greater. The Parthians had ruled through accommodation and compromise. The Sassanids would rule through vision and iron will. It was a revolution disguised as a restoration, and it would reshape the ancient world forever. Imagine walking through a Sassanid city at dawn. As the first rays of sunlight pierce the morning mist, you hear something extraordinary, the sound of prayers echoing from towering structures across the landscape. But these aren't ordinary temples with golden statues or ornate altars. These are fire temples, and within their walls burns something sacred, eternal flames that have been tended day and night for centuries. This was the heart of the Sassanid Empire, a civilization where religion wasn't just a personal belief, but the very soul that bound an entire realm together. For over 400 years, these sacred fires would burn as beacons of a faith that shaped not just how people worshipped, but how they lived, how they governed, and how they saw their place in the cosmic battle between light and darkness. To understand the Sassanids, you have to understand Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions. Founded by the prophet Zoroaster centuries earlier, this faith taught that the universe was locked in an eternal struggle between Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom and Light, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of darkness. But under the Sassanids, Zoroastrianism became far more than just a religion. Zoroastrianism was declared the state religion, and the empire's administration was centralized to maintain control over its diverse regions. It became the foundation of royal legitimacy, the source of imperial law, and the unifying force that held together an empire stretching from Syria to India. The Sassanids aggressively promoted the Zurvanite form of Zoroastrianism, often building fire temples in captured territories to promote the religion. Every conquered city, every new province, would soon see the construction of these magnificent temples where sacred fires burned continuously. The message was clear. This was now part of the realm of light, the domain of Ahura Mazda, the empire of the righteous. Walking into a Sassanid fire temple was an awe-inspiring experience. The early Sassanids ruled against the use of cult images in worship, and so statues and idols were removed from many temples and, where possible, sacred fires were installed instead. Instead of elaborate sculptures or painted frescoes, the focus was entirely on the sacred flame burning at the altar, a living symbol of divine presence that never wavered, never dimmed, never died. These weren't just religious buildings, they were statements of imperial power. The largest fire temples rivaled royal palaces in their grandeur, with soaring arches, intricate stonework, and halls that could accommodate hundreds of worshippers. The priests who tended these flames weren't merely religious figures. They were part of the imperial administration, educated bureaucrats who helped run the empire. But here's where the story becomes fascinating. The Sassanids managed to create something almost unprecedented in the ancient world. They built a society where religious orthodoxy coexisted with practical tolerance, where imperial unity was maintained without completely crushing diversity. Jews, Christians, Buddhists, Manichaeans, and others lived and, at times, thrived under a Zoroastrian king. This wasn't the modern concept of religious freedom as we understand it today, but it was something remarkable for its time. Christians, Jews, and adherents of other religions were often permitted to practice their faith relatively freely. The shifting approach to religious policy reflected the Sassanians' need to balance religious unity with cultural diversity. Picture the complexity of this arrangement. In the same city where Zoroastrian priests maintained eternal flames, Jewish merchants could operate synagogues, Christian artisans could attend their churches, and Buddhist monks could pursue their meditations. The empire needed their skills, their trade networks, their knowledge, and their loyalty. Practical governance often trumped religious purity, yet this tolerance had its limits and its contradictions. When political tensions arose, when wars with Christian Byzantium intensified, or when religious minorities were perceived as threats to imperial stability, the iron fist could emerge from the velvet glove. The phrase, "but dissenters faced the sword," captures a harsh reality. Tolerance was a privilege that could be revoked, not a guaranteed right. While the Sassanids were revolutionizing religious policy, they were simultaneously creating something even more lasting, a new way of governing an empire. They invented what they called the divan, a sophisticated bureaucratic system that would outlive their empire by centuries. The first divan appeared under the Caliph Umar, 634-644, as a pensions list, recording free Arab warriors entitled to a share of the spoils of war. But the Islamic caliphs were adapting and expanding a system the Sassanids had already perfected. The empire was strongly centralized and was administered by a highly structured bureaucracy that included priests of the state religion, Zoroastrianism. Think of the divan as the world's first comprehensive civil service. Instead of relying solely on noble birth or military prowess, the Sassanids created specialized departments staffed by educated officials who kept detailed records, collected taxes efficiently, managed royal correspondence, and coordinated the complex logistics of ruling a vast empire. This wasn't just innovative, it was revolutionary. Previous empires had ruled through personal relationships, tribal loyalties, and military force. The Sassanids ruled through information, organization, and institutional memory. When a provincial governor died, his replacement could step into an existing system with detailed records, established procedures, and trained staff. The irony of history is exquisite. When Arab armies finally conquered the Sassanid Empire in the 7th century after Christ, they didn't destroy the administrative system they found. Instead, they adopted it wholesale. The cultural legacy of the diwans, the governance of Islamic caliphates and empires, with a hierarchical organization and specialized departments handling state affairs from fiscal management to military operations. The very bureaucrats who had once served Zoroastrian kings now served Muslim caliphs, using the same filing systems, the same administrative procedures, the same governmental structures. The Sassanid Divan became the backbone of Islamic administration from Spain to Central Asia. In a very real sense, the Sassanids continued to govern the Middle East long after their empire had fallen. But perhaps the most profound legacy was spiritual rather than administrative. The Sassanids had proven that an empire could be held together not just by armies and bureaucrats, but by shared faith and common purpose. They showed that diversity and unity weren't necessarily contradictory, that tolerance and orthodoxy could coexist, and that the sacred and the secular could work in harmony. When you walked through that Sassanid city at dawn, hearing those prayers echoing from the fire temples, you were witnessing something extraordinary. A civilization that had learned to balance the demands of the divine with the necessities of earthly rule. It was an empire of fire and faith, where eternal flames burned not just in temples, but in the hearts of people who believed they were part of something greater than themselves. And that perhaps was the real secret of Sassanid power, not just the fear of the sword, but the inspiring vision of a world where light triumphed over darkness, where order conquered chaos, and where the faithful could build something eternal in a world of constant change. Are you fascinated by this ancient legacy? Then comment your thoughts, like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more epic journeys. Picture this scene. It's the year 260 after Christ, and something unprecedented is happening in the ancient world. A Roman emperor, the most powerful man on earth, ruler of legions that had conquered from Britain to Egypt, is kneeling before a Persian king, not negotiating, not surrendering with dignity, kneeling in absolute submission while his captor sits triumphantly on horseback above him. This wasn't just a military defeat. This was a shattering of everything Romans believed about their empire's invincibility. And the Persian king who orchestrated this humiliation, his name was Shapur I, and he was about to become Rome's worst nightmare. Shapur inherited the throne in 241 after Christ, but he wasn't content to simply maintain his father's empire. He had grander ambitions, to prove that Persia was not just Rome's equal, but its superior. Where previous Persian rulers had fought defensive wars, Shapur would wage campaigns of conquest and psychological warfare that would haunt Roman dreams for generations. The showdown came at a place called Edessa, in what is now southeastern Turkey. Emperor Valerian had marched east with a massive army, confident that Roman military might would crush these upstart Persians once and for all. Instead, he became the first Roman emperor in history to be captured alive in battle, a humiliation so profound that it sent shockwaves throughout the civilized world. But Shapur wasn't finished with his psychological warfare. He ordered a relief to be carved into the living rock at Naqsh-e-Rostam, showing himself on horseback, receiving the surrender of the kneeling Valerian. This wasn't just art. It was propaganda carved in stone, designed to last forever and remind anyone who saw it that even the mightiest Roman emperor could be brought to his knees by Persian power. Located just 3 kilometers north of the ruins of Persepolis, this relief at Naqsh-e-Rostam is the most impressive of 8 Sassanid rock carvings cut into the cliff beneath the tombs of their Achaemenid predecessors. Imagine the symbolism. Shapur literally carved his victory into the same sacred site where the ancient Persian kings like Darius and Xerxes lay buried, linking his triumph to the glorious legacy of old Persia. The relief shows more than just Valerian's submission. Behind the triumphant Shapur, we can see his high priest Cartier saluting, and the scene also depicts the dead emperor Gordian, another Roman ruler who had fallen to Persian might. This was Shapur's way of announcing to the world that he hadn't just defeated one emperor, he had systematically dismantled Roman power in the East. The craftsmanship itself tells a story. Every fold in Shapur's royal robes, every detail of his horse's elaborate harness, every gesture of triumph and submission was carved with meticulous precision. This wasn't hasty battlefield graffiti. This was a carefully planned masterpiece designed to proclaim Persian superiority for all eternity. And it worked. That relief is still there today, after more than 1,700 years, still showing a Roman emperor kneeling before a Persian king. Empires have risen and fallen. Civilizations have come and gone. But Shapur's stone triumph remains as vivid as the day it was completed. But Shapur's victories weren't built on military might alone. The Sassanids had a secret weapon that was perhaps even more powerful than their armies. They had mastered the art of making deserts bloom. Throughout the arid regions of Iran, agricultural and permanent settlements were supported by the ancient Qanat system of tapping alluvial aquifers at the heads of valleys and conducting the water along underground tunnels by gravity, often over many kilometers. Think about the incredible engineering this required, digging miles of underground channels through solid rock, calculating precise gradients to ensure water flow, creating access shafts for maintenance, all without modern machinery or surveying equipment. These qanats were series of well-like vertical shafts connected by gently sloping tunnels that channeled groundwater from aquifers to the surface through interconnected underground passages. The genius of the system was that it allowed groundwater to flow freely and continuously without energy input, like a natural spring that could flow without interruption throughout the year due to the enormous storage capacity of the aquifer. The impact of this technology was revolutionary. By harnessing underground water and transporting it across vast distances, the Persians turned deserts into fertile farmland and created thriving cities in the harshest environments. Some qanats could discharge up to 150 liters per second, allowing for the irrigation of 150 hectares of agricultural land. Picture the transformation this created, where once there had been nothing but barren sand and scattered nomads. Suddenly there were green fields, prosperous towns, and flourishing trade routes. The Sassanids could support large populations in regions that should have been uninhabitable. They could maintain armies in territories where their enemies would struggle just to find drinking water. This wasn't just about agriculture. It was about power projection. An empire that could make deserts bloom could also support the logistics of long military campaigns. While Roman armies struggled with supply lines stretched across hostile terrain, Sassanid forces could operate from a network of oasis cities connected by this underground lifeline. The technology spread through Silk Road trade and Muslim conquest, and qanats can be found as far as Morocco and Spain. Iranian farmers in places like Yazd province have been using these subterranean tunnels for nearly 3 millennia, and many are still functioning today. This combination of military brilliance and technological innovation made the Sassanids something Rome had never faced before, a true rival superpower. Previous enemies, Gauls, Germans, Parthians, had been formidable but ultimately limited by their resources or organization. The Sassanids were different. They had the agricultural base to support massive armies, the administrative skills to coordinate complex campaigns, the engineering expertise to operate in impossible terrain, and the cultural confidence to challenge Rome's claim to universal dominion. When Roman senators looked east, they no longer saw barbarian tribes or decaying kingdoms. They saw an empire as sophisticated as their own, ruled by kings who called themselves equals to Roman emperors, defended by armies that could capture Roman eagles, and supported by cities that rivaled Alexandria or Antioch in their splendor. The relief at Naqsh Rostam wasn't just Shapur's victory monument. It was a declaration that the age of Roman supremacy was over. From that moment forward, every Roman emperor would have to reckon with the possibility that he might end up like Valerian, kneeling in submission before a Persian king while his humiliation was carved into stone for all eternity. The genius of the Sassanids lay in understanding that true power came not just from winning battles, but from building something that could last. Their qanats turned temporary military victories into permanent territorial gains. Their monuments transformed fleeting triumphs into eternal propaganda. Their combination of practical engineering and psychological warfare created an empire that could challenge Rome on every level. When you stand before that relief at Naqsh Rostam today, you're not just looking at ancient art. You're witnessing the moment when Rome realized it was no longer the only superpower in the world. And somewhere in the desert around you, ancient qanats might still be flowing, carrying water through tunnels dug by Persian hands more than 1,000 years ago, still turning sand into life, still proving that the Sassanids built not just an empire, but a legacy that outlasted even their conquerors. Picture the scene. It's the year 632 after Christ, and in the royal palace at Ctesiphon, a young man named Yazdegerd III has just inherited the most poisoned crown in history. At barely 20 years old, he has become the last emperor of a dynasty that had ruled Persia for over 4 centuries. But his empire is dying, and he knows it. All around him, the evidence of collapse is impossible to ignore. The royal treasury is nearly empty. The army that once made Roman emperors kneel is exhausted and demoralized. The great cities that had symbolized Persian power are struggling to maintain their basic functions. And somewhere to the south, beyond the desert borders that had protected Persia for generations, a new force is stirring, one that will sweep away everything the Sassanids had built. To understand how the mighty Sassanid Empire fell so completely, we need to go back 26 years earlier to 606 after Christ, when Khosrow II launched what would become the final war between Persia and Rome. This wasn't just another border skirmish or territorial dispute. This was total war, a cataclysmic struggle that would consume both empires and leave them defenseless against threats they never saw coming. For 26 years, These two superpowers threw everything they had at each other. Between them, the Byzantines and the Sassanians had lost well over 400,000 first-rate fighting troops. Think about what that means. Not just the soldiers who died, but the officers with decades of experience, the engineers who understood siege warfare, the cavalry commanders who had perfected their tactics over lifetimes of service. All gone, buried in unmarked graves across Syria, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. The economic cost was even more devastating. Both empires had poured their entire treasuries into this endless conflict. Taxes had been raised to crushing levels, trade routes had been disrupted, farmlands had been abandoned as peasants were conscripted into armies that never returned home. Cities that had flourished for centuries were now struggling to repair their walls or maintain their aqueducts. But perhaps most tragically, this war had accomplished absolutely nothing. After 26 years of mutual destruction, the borders were essentially the same as they had been at the beginning. Both empires were back where they started, except now they were broken, exhausted, and vulnerable. The same year that some semblance of order was restored with Yazdegerd III's accession, the first raiders from the Arab tribes newly united by Islam arrived in Persian territory. At first, these raids seemed like nothing more than the usual tribal incursions that both empires had dealt with for centuries. Desert nomads had always tested the borders, looking for easy plunder before retreating to their oases and camps. But something was different this time. These weren't disorganized raiders seeking quick riches. They were disciplined armies fighting with a sense of divine mission that gave them extraordinary courage and unity. They moved with a speed and coordination that the exhausted Persian defenders couldn't match. Most importantly, they came not just to raid, but to conquer and stay. The young Emperor Yazdegerd tried desperately to mount an effective defense, but everything was working against him. His armies were depleted and demoralized from the long war with Byzantium. His treasuries were empty, making it impossible to hire new troops or maintain proper equipment. His administrative system, once the envy of the ancient world, was struggling just to collect taxes and maintain basic communication with the provinces. The Battle of Al-Qadisiyah took place between the armies of the Rashidun Caliphate and the Sassanid Empire in November 636. This wasn't just another military defeat. It was the moment when 4 centuries of Persian imperial power began to unravel completely. The Arab victory over the army of Yazdegerd III marked the end of his dynasty and the beginning of Arab and Islamic rule in Persia. But the young emperor refused to accept that his empire was finished. He retreated eastward, desperately trying to rally his remaining forces for one final stand that might save at least part of his heritage. Ctesiphon, the imperial capital of the Sassanid Empire, fell in March 637 after a siege of 3 months. Picture the symbolism of this moment. The city that had been the beating heart of Persian power for centuries, where Shapur I had once displayed captured Roman standards, where generations of King of Kings had held court in unimaginable splendor, was now in the hands of Arab warriors who had emerged from the desert just a few years earlier. The fall of Ctesiphon was more than a military victory. It was a psychological earthquake that shattered Persian confidence across the empire. If the capital itself couldn't withstand the Arab assault, what hope did the outlying provinces have? The Arab squadrons defeated the Persian army in several more battles, culminating in the Battle of Nahavand, the last major battle of the Sassanids. By this point, Yazdegerd had retreated deep into the Persian heartland, making desperate attempts to organize resistance from the mountainous regions where he hoped the terrain might give his forces some advantage. But it was too late. The empire was disintegrating around him, not just from external pressure, but from internal collapse. Provincial governors were making their own deals with the advancing Arabs. Nobles who had once competed for the privilege of serving at court were now primarily concerned with protecting their personal estates. The great bureaucratic machine that had held the empire together was breaking down as communication networks failed and administrative centers fell to the conquerors. The Battle of Nahavand sealed the empire's fate. After this defeat, Organized Persian resistance effectively ceased. What followed was not so much conquest as occupation. Arab forces moved into regions where local authorities had already decided that submission was preferable to destruction. Yazdegerd met his end at the hands of a miller near Merv in 651, bringing an end to the last pre-Islamic Iranian empire after more than 400 years of rule. This wasn't the glorious death of a warrior king falling sword in hand against overwhelming odds. It was the shabby, almost accidental end of a young man who had been reduced to begging for shelter from common citizens. The symbolism is heartbreaking. Yazdegerd, whose name meant God-made, who claimed descent from the great Achaemenid kings, who had inherited the title of King of Kings, died alone and friendless in a dusty provincial town, killed by a miller who probably didn't even realize he was murdering the last emperor of Persia. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Sassanid collapse was how quickly it happened. In just 20 years, an empire that had rivaled Rome and Byzantium, that had controlled trade routes from India to the Mediterranean, that had commanded the loyalty of millions, simply vanished from history. This wasn't a gradual decline spread over generations. It was a sudden, catastrophic collapse that left contemporaries stunned. People who had grown up assuming the Sassanid Empire was a permanent feature of the world lived to see it completely erased, replaced by a new civilization with different laws, different customs, different faith, and different ambitions. The exhaustion from the long war with Byzantium explains the military vulnerability, but the speed of collapse suggests something deeper. Perhaps the empire had become too dependent on its administrative machinery, too centralized to adapt when that machinery broke down. When the center could no longer hold, everything fell apart at once. When Yazdegerd died in that mill in Merv, more than just a dynasty ended. With him died the last link to ancient Persia, the final echo of Cyrus and Darius, the last guardian of traditions that stretched back over 1,000 years. The fire temples that had burned continuously for centuries would soon be abandoned or converted. The priests who had maintained the sacred flames would scatter or convert to new faiths. The courtly traditions, the royal ceremonies, the administrative systems, all would be replaced by something entirely different. Yet in another sense, the Sassanids had won a kind of victory even in defeat. Their administrative systems would be adopted by their conquerors. Their cultural traditions would survive in new forms. Their language and customs would influence Islamic civilization for centuries to come. Even as their empire died, their legacy lived on, woven into the fabric of the new world that arose from their ashes. The last great Persian empire had fallen, but Persia itself endured, transformed but not destroyed, ready to rise again in new forms when history's wheel turned once more. Sometimes the most powerful legacies are the ones that survive their creators. Standing today among the ruins of Persepolis or gazing up at the weathered relief of Shapur I at Nakshi Rostam, you might think you're looking at the remnants of a completely vanished civilization. But the truth is far more remarkable. The Sassanids may have lost their empire, but they won something far more lasting: immortality. Their story didn't end with Yazdegerd's death in that dusty mill near Merv. Instead, it transformed, flowing like an underground river through the centuries, surfacing in unexpected places, shaping civilizations that came after them in ways both obvious and subtle. The Sassanids had become something more powerful than any empire. They had become an idea. Picture this extraordinary transformation. The very Arab conquerors who had shattered Sassanid military power found themselves, almost without realizing it, governing their new territories using Sassanid methods. The Muslim conquest of Iran marked a significant religious shift, but the Islamization of Iran enabled the gradual absorption of Sasanian art, architecture, music, literature, and philosophy into nascent Islamic culture. The divan system that we discussed earlier, that revolutionary bureaucracy that the Sassanids had perfected, became the backbone of Islamic administration from Spain to Central Asia. Former Sassanid civil servants who knew how to collect taxes efficiently, maintain detailed records, and coordinate the complex logistics of governing vast territories simply continued their work under new masters. The filing systems remained the same. The administrative procedures endured. Even the government buildings continued to function as they had for centuries. But the influence ran far deeper than mere bureaucracy. Many aspects of Islamic culture, including music, art, architecture, philosophy, and literature, were largely derived from Persian civilization. The conquerors discovered that they had inherited not just territory, but an entire sophisticated culture that was in many ways more advanced than their own. What's truly remarkable is how Persian identity not only survived, but flourished under Islamic rule. Iran, despite its conquest by the armies of Islam, retained its own Persian language and much of its culture. While the political structure changed completely, the deeper cultural foundations that the Sassanids had laid proved unshakable. The Persian language, enriched by centuries of Sassanid court poetry and administrative terminology, adapted and evolved rather than disappearing. Persian literature, with its epic tales of ancient heroes and kings, continued to be copied and recited. Persian architectural styles, with their distinctive domes and elegant proportions, influenced mosque design across the Islamic world. Even more fascinating is how the Sassanid concept of kingship survived. The Islamic caliphs might have rejected the title of King of Kings as blasphemous, but they adopted many of the ceremonial practices, administrative methods, and even the physical symbols of Sassanid imperial power. The very idea of a centralized empire ruling over diverse peoples with different languages and customs, this was a Sassanid innovation that became the template for Islamic expansion. Perhaps most significantly, the Sassanians started a process of Iranization that would reinstate the values of Iranian culture. They had given their people something precious, a name and an identity that transcended any single dynasty or political system. When Ardashir first called his realm Iranshar, the land of the Iranians, he wasn't just changing a geographical designation. He was creating a concept of national identity that would prove more durable than any fortress or army. The word Iran itself is the modern descendant of this Sassanid innovation, and today's Islamic Republic of Iran still carries within its very name the legacy of that ancient Zoroastrian Empire. This is extraordinary when you think about it. The religious system changed completely. The political structure was replaced entirely. The ruling dynasty vanished without trace. Yet the name and identity that the Sassanids had forged endured through 13 centuries of Islamic rule, through Mongol invasions, through Ottoman pressure, through colonial interference, through revolution and war, right down to our present day. Walk through any Persian garden today, and you're experiencing a Sassanid legacy. Those formal layouts with their geometric precision, their integration of water features, their careful balance between architecture and nature, these trace their origins to the palatial gardens that Sassanid kings created 15 centuries ago. Listen to Persian poetry, and you're hearing echoes of Sassanid court culture. The elaborate metaphors, the celebration of royal virtues, the mystical symbolism that runs through classical Persian verse, all of these have roots that extend back to the Zoroastrian fire temples and royal ceremonies of the Sassanid era. Even Persian cuisine carries forward ancient traditions. The elaborate rice dishes, the use of saffron and rosewater, the combination of sweet and savory flavors. These aren't just recipes, they're cultural memories preserved in taste and aroma, passed down through generations from the kitchens of Sassanid palaces to modern Persian families around the world. This brings us to one of history's most tantalizing questions. What if the Sassanids had survived? What if they had somehow found the strength to resist the Arab conquest, or adapted quickly enough to maintain their independence under Islamic rule? Would Persian Zoroastrianism have evolved into something resembling a monotheistic religion capable of holding its own against Islam and Christianity? Would the sophisticated Sassanid administrative system have led to even more advanced forms of government? Would the Persian Empire have become a maritime power, sending ships to explore new lands and establish trade networks that might have changed the course of global history? We'll never know, but it's fascinating to consider. What we do know is that the Sassanids had demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation and innovation. They had successfully transformed themselves from a regional rebellion into a superpower. They had maintained their empire for over 4 centuries through constant military pressure from Rome and Byzantium. They had created administrative and cultural systems sophisticated enough to be adopted by their conquerors. Perhaps their survival was impossible given the exhaustion from the Byzantine wars and the sudden emergence of Islamic expansion. Or perhaps some different decision, some alternative strategy, some stroke of fortune might have allowed them to endure and evolve as their Chinese contemporaries did. In the end, though, the question of survival misses the deeper truth of the Sassanid story. They did survive, not as a political entity, but as something more enduring. They became part of the cultural DNA of an entire civilization. Every time someone refers to Iran rather than Persia, they're using a Sassanid innovation. Every time an Islamic government employs bureaucratic methods that trace back to the divan system, they're implementing Sassanid administrative genius. Every time Persian is spoken, Persian poetry is recited, or Persian customs are observed, the Sassanids live on. The sacred fires in their temples may have been extinguished centuries ago, but the cultural flame they lit still burns. It burns in the pride of modern Iranians in their ancient heritage. It burns in the architectural beauty of Isfahan and Shiraz. It burns in the verses of Hafez and the stories of Shahnameh. It burns in the very idea that Iran is not just a place on the map, but a civilization with its own distinct identity and contribution to make to the world. The Sassanids were indeed the last guardians of ancient Persia, but they were also the first architects of something new. A Persian identity strong enough to survive conquest, flexible enough to adapt to change, and precious enough to be treasured and preserved by generation after generation of people who might never have heard the names of Ardashir or Shapur, but who still live within the cultural framework those ancient kings created. That is their true victory and their most enduring monument. What lessons can we draw from this ancient tradition? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more untold stories of the ancient world.